Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices, focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and hosted by World Information Transfer. Our speaker today is Mr. Ayder Seiytosmanov. Mr. Seiytosmanov is a Ukrainian expert in public administration and governance, with over 2 decades of experience in project management and decentralization reforms. He holds an IT communication degree from the University of Information Technology in Tashkent, a master's degree in public administration from the National Academy of Public Administration in Ukraine, and studied a PhD in political science. Mr. Seiytosmanov has worked with organizations like UNDP, SALAR International, a Swedish association of local authorities and regions, and GIS, a German corporation for international cooperation. He has been focusing on democracy, leadership, local governance, and regional development. A former member of the Mejlis of Crimean Tatars, he has contributed to strengthening civic society and published extensively on social cohesion and governance reforms in Ukraine. Over to you, Mr. Seiytosmanov.
Thank you. My name is Ayder Seiytosmanov. I want to present a historical perspective of Ukrainians' independence from 30 years ago. I also believe this story will be helpful in understanding in the current situation in Ukraine and thinking about Ukrainian strategic development and future. After 2 years of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the heroic struggle for independence, discussions have intensified within Ukrainian society on questions such as: what should the Ukrainian political nation be based on? What principles should guide its formation? How can Ukrainians' ethnic groups with historically complex relationships be harmoniously united into the single political nation? In fact, these questions have been relevant in since 1991, when Ukraine became an independent state. However, today, with the cohesion and consolidation of all Ukrainian citizens, regardless of their ethnic backgrounds, being key to victory of the enemy, the formation of the political nations has become particularly important. It's clear that 30 years is too short a time for Ukraine for fully development a capable political nation. Other countries' experience show that it often takes decades or even centuries for the dominant ethnic community and minorities to unite into the consolidated political nation. At the same time, simply living together in a state does not guarantee that an ethnic nation will transform to a political nation. There is always the risk that states with weak consolidation will turn toward despotism or face civil conflict. In this presentation, I will talk about historical event that took place in Crimea in 1991, the first years of Ukrainian independence. Since then, a new generation have been born and grown up in Ukraine, reading about 1991 in books. Perhaps this history of Crimea is not well known to them. but its consequences still play an important role in Ukraine's development as a democratic and European state. Without the formation of the political nation, is it impossible to consolidate society? That is not just only about war. Without national consolidation, Ukraine can't achieve its strategic goal, ensure a stable political development, or implement reform in various sectors. Economic stabilization and growth are also impossible without national unity. This story explains the unique opportunity Ukraine has had and still has to form a strong political nations. Let's go back in 1991. In that time, the USSR, which had terrified the world for 70 years, was beginning to collapse. And Ukraine's path toward independence was rapidly emerging. While national patriotic forces in Ukraine were focused on fighting for independence, in the same time, in Crimea, the pro-Russian majority was moving toward separating Crimea from Ukraine and allying it with Russia. In 1991, the pro-Russian separatist movement in Crimea faced a problem. First, it's important to remember political prisoners were being released from Soviet prisons. Among them was Ukrainian famous dissident Vyacheslav Chernovil and Crimean Tatars leader Mustafa Dzhemilov. Second, between 1988 and 1991, hundreds of thousands Crimean Tatars who had been deported to Central Asia for 50 years began returning to Crimea. The pro-Russian majority greeted them with hostility, aiming to provoke intellectual conflicts, which would give Russia a pretext to militarily protect Russian people in Crimea. However, the Crimean Tatars avoided provocations, rebuilt their communities, opened schools, worked to preserve their culture. In July 1991, Crimean Tatars held their national congress, known as the Kurultai, and elected leaders of the Mejlis. A month later, Ukraine declared independence and the first presidential election took place. The Crimean Tatars, through Kurultai, decided to support the candidacy of Vyacheslav Chernovil, Ukrainian leader. The question arises, why did Crimean Tatars choose to support Ukraine in 1991 and continue to be the most pro-Ukrainian group in Crimea for subsequent years? The answer is simple: joint values. These values had developed over centuries despite the difficult history between two peoples. In 1991, sensing Ukraine's desire for freedom, the Crimean Tatars declared Crimea is Ukrainian and have worked with Ukraine to build a free European democratic state. All these years until the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the Crimean Tatars proved by their strategy and their actions that they, together with Ukrainians, are a political nation of Ukraine. On February 26, 2014, separatists in the Crimean parliament began a session to decide on the referendum on joining Russia. However, thousands of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians gathered under the Crimean and Ukrainian flags in front of the Crimean parliament. The protest rally in February 2026 did not allow the pro-Russian authorities of Crimea to make a decision against Ukraine. On this day, Mejlis was able to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine. Then, on the night of February 27, Russian troops were forced to seize governmental building in Crimea. In large-scale military invasion of Crimea has begun. Arrests of pro-Ukrainian activists, closure of Ukrainian schools, and destruction of any symbol of Ukraine began in Crimea. 8 months later, Russian authority in Crimea arrested the office of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatars in Simferopol. The last Ukrainian flag in Crimea was removed from this building, Mejlis building. Today, Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians continue to defend Ukraine together. Together with Ukrainian heroes and Crimean Tatars and representatives of other nationalities die. Together with the Ukrainian people, the Crimean Tatars are fighting for victory of Ukraine. Experts say that a political nation is formed when different ethnic communities unite around joint history, values, and institutions. In Ukraine, this process of national consolidation through long and complex shows great promise. This story of how the Crimean Tatars identified themselves as part of Ukraine's political nations 30 years ago, first years of Ukrainian independence, and have defended their identity, even since illustrated Ukraine's potential to become a strong democratic country. This case is not to lose this chance. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I will now pass on the questions that have been given to me. First question, how do you assess the current situation regarding the rights of Crimean Tatars in occupied Crimea? And what measures can the international community take to protect them?
After the Crimean Tatars initially conducted this meeting on February 26th, which I mentioned in my speech. Then they boycotted the referendum, the so-called referendum on Crimea joining Russia. Afterwards, there were many actions in support of Ukraine. Of course, the Crimean Tatars were the first to face repression. Among the nearly 200 political prisoners currently in Russian prisons, 70% are Crimean Tatars. Many Crimean Tatars, especially members of the Mejlis and other political leaders, were forced to move to mainland Ukraine. Some of them are arrested, but also good news. For example, a month ago, the first deputy chairman of the Mejlis Nariman Zhelyalov was released during an exchange. At the same time, many Crimean Tatars are still under repression, constantly under the watch of law enforcement and the occupying authorities. On the other hand, the international community, they support the Crimean Tatars, the leaders of the Crimean Tatars at various stages of the European Union, United Nations, and constantly listen to reports about human rights violations of Crimean Tatars in Crimea. A lot or a little from the point of view of Ukraine's capabilities. The Crimean Tatar leaders, this is a huge effort. Unfortunately, there are few results because the Russian authorities, the occupying authorities, almost do not react to this protests of the international community. And so the repressions continue.
Thank you. Second question. How, in your opinion, can mutual understanding between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars be improved to strengthen interethnic unity in the country?
Until 2014, you might say, most Ukrainians knew about Crimea as the sea, the mountains where you could go on vacation. The Crimean Tatars live there, who protect Ukraine as a European country, knew only maybe friends of Crimean Tatars or political leaders of Ukraine. After 2014, when Crimea was annexed, I often heard people saying that they regretted losing Crimea and wondered how they would go to the sea now. But it was not about the Crimean Tatars. And only recently has the Ukrainian government started paying more attention to the Crimean Tatars and valuing the Crimean Tatar community's support in defending Ukraine. A law was passed regarding indigenous peoples, and I remind you that the indigenous peoples of Ukraine are considered to be the Crimean Tatars, the Karaitis, and the Krimchaks, all of whom have formed and lived in Crimea, the occupied Crimea. I think the most important thing is that when young political leaders, Ukrainian, Crimean, and Tatar, thought of Crimea, of Ukrainian Crimea, they thought not only of the sea and mountains or vacations there, but also about what foundations of mutual understanding can be built to create common strategies. How can Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars help each other shape the very Ukrainian political nation? Because if it is not formed, if it remains in its current state, it will be very difficult for Ukraine to overcome the enemy, to establish itself as a democratic European country. So the main message is that Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians, through their relationships and partnerships, can set an example for other ethnic communities living in Ukraine, that Ukraine is a shared home, that Ukraine is a shared homeland, that we can build this country together, and we can, despite all the contradictions and all the problems that exist between ethnic groups, including not so simple concerns. These are all historical issues, but the future is a democratic Ukraine, and it can only be built through dialogue, consolidation, and partnership. And the fact that today the Crimean Tatars, the leaders of the Crimean Tatars, the Mejlis, in partnership with representatives of Ukrainian political parties, the state, civic leaders of civil society are doing this in order to, as quickly as possible, to ensure the liberation of Crimea. This is precisely an example of how different communities in one country can work together for common goals.
Thank you. Next question. Is there generally any collective resistance in Crimea?
This question is very complex. And, you know, since the times of Gandhi, when you remain silent, your silence is also a form of protest. And you can live in this country or on this territory, but you do not agree with it. You have no joy, no love for this authority, for this regime. You are forced to live because your parents live close to you, your children. You do your work, but by your life you show that you do not accept this authority. And that's exactly the situation most Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians who stayed in Crimea find themselves in. Any open resistance, or even just a word, or even if you were yellow and blue clothing, this is considered a provocation, and the person is arrested and sanctioned. I think that the most Crimean Tatars, and not only Crimean Tatars, in Crimea, they remember, they keep their thoughts about Ukraine. But it's very important that, and outside Crimea, we actively worked to support those who stayed in Crimea. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, all schools have been closed, if anyone knows, Ukrainian schools. Crimean Tatar schools remain, but the teaching time has been so reduced that soon Crimean Tatars might not be able to speak their native language after such education. Any mention of Ukraine, especially in recent times after the full-scale invasion, is forbidden. It is very, very difficult, but still, people do not lose hope for liberation and return to Ukraine.
Thank you. I also want to say that, as you know, Russia has always tried to destroy the Ukrainian language, even though the Ukrainian language has been here since 1998, when Moscow and Russia did not even exist yet. So this is typical of Russian deception. Stop forbidding people from speaking their language. So it's not surprising, but the question remains how the cultural heritage of Crimean Tatars can influence the contemporary formation of Ukrainian culture.
I think that they, in fact, over many centuries, Ukrainian and Crimean cultures have complemented each other. It's only in Russian history textbooks. It seems like it was some constant aggression between the people. In fact, it was two nations
developed together.
I believe the cultural connection has always been there. Now, for example, music bands are very popular when Crimean Tatars play their melodies, and Ukrainian singers sing in the Crimean Tatar language. Then they sing Ukrainian songs.
Exactly.
And Ukrainians learn more about them.
That's true.
Crimean Tatar Kubanka,
Culture.
on the other hand, this is very important for the Crimean Tatars. due to the interest of Ukrainian musicians and artists, which preserves Crimean Tatar culture, currently threatened with extinction. It is very important to have as many joint cultural projects with Crimean Tatars as possible. These could be projects in the economic field, folklore, music, poetry, literature, any such directions that might be interesting, showcasing the richness of each of these cultures. I know there's such a competition, special literary competition called Crimean Fig, with different nominations. For example, when Ukrainians read or translate the poetry of Crimean Tatars, Ukrainian language from the times of the Crimean Khanate or modern times. In turn, Crimean Tatars translate Ukrainian poetry, Ukrainian literature from Ukrainian into Crimean Tatar language. This way, there's an exchange of knowledge. Of each of these cultures expand the platform for dialogue and mutual understanding.
Thank you. Next question. Which topics related to the integration of the Crimean Tatar people into Ukrainian society need more media coverage?
Very good question. I think the most important thing is understanding the role the Crimean Tatar community has played since 1991. Why did the Crimean Tatars choose Ukraine back then? I remember I was a witness and participant of these events when the pro-Russian majority said, "Why do you need Ukraine? Support us. Russia will help everyone. It is so capable." Being a patriot of Ukraine in Crimea is more difficult. To some extent, you understand what I'm saying, than in Lviv. In Crimea TQ, the Crimean Tatars always tried to emphasize their support for Ukraine. They supported Vyacheslav Chornovol in the first presidential elections.
Crimea is a flag, a ram.
The KTTA was always together with the Ukrainian flag at all the events conducted by the Crimean Tatars until the last moment. As I already said, the last Ukrainian flag was removed from the building of the Crimean Tatar Mejlis 8 months after the occupation of Crimea, when it was also seized. And it is very important that Ukrainians know and value this, and then this becomes the basis which society, the Ukrainian society, understood why now the Ukrainian state support certain political directions of the Crimean Tatars regarding the preservation of the Crimean Tatar language and the defense of certain rights. Why is this important? It is not accidental. It's the result of understanding that for 30 years, you see, it was not an opportunistic move, that 1 year the Crimean Tatars supported Ukrainian and pro-Ukrainian forces. And the next year others. Then there was Yanukovych. There was more. This was always the case, that a representative from the commissariat was always beside the leaders of the Ukrainian National Democratic Movement. That's why it's important to know this first. Second, the Crimean Tatars need support from Ukraine and Ukrainians to preserve their language. Our language is on the brink of extinction, complete extinction. We understand, you correctly said, that this resulted from the constant Russian policy of assimilating national minorities and everyone living in this empire. but that's how it happened at that time. The Crimean Tatars are at such a crossroads. Generations later, 2 generations later, this language could disappear. And without Ukraine, without the support of Ukrainians, without the support of Ukrainian scientists and society, the Crimean Tatars won't be able to preserve their language. This is very possible. The same applies to culture. But for this to happen, first and foremost, it's important to understand the role of the Crimean Tatars in Crimea. Why today Ukraine, maybe Ukrainian political leaders say confidently, Crimea is Ukraine. Why alongside them are leaders of the Crimean Tatars like Mustafa Djemilev, Refa Chubarov, Nariman Jelial, who was released a month ago, and others. This needs to be understood, and then this support indeed becomes really important to help the Crimean Tatars survive. And I think this is also an example for other ethnic groups that Ukraine cares not only about preserving its own culture and language, but also cares about other ethnic communities, just like any democratic country would, caring about their preservation, their authenticity, preserving their culture. This is also part of it, of the policy of mutual understanding and the unity of Ukrainian society.
Thank you. Next question. What role should the international community play in protecting the rights of the Crimean Tatars?
Just one thing. It should constantly and systematically remind the whole world, Russia, the political leadership of Russia.
What?
Crimea, the Crimean Tatars. The Crimean Tatars are citizens of Ukraine. Their rights should be protected through the return of Crimea. That the Crimean Tatars are an indigenous people of Ukraine. Only by constantly reminding, we can probably achieve certain goals and help the Crimean Tatars.
Thanks for the subtitles. Thanks for watching. What role should journalism play in highlighting the problems of Crimean Tatars and the occupation of Crimea? Should it be aimed at more intensive science?
A lot of events related to Crimea are being remembered now. Crimea is trending, as they say, but sometimes we remember Crimea only as a territory. I think it's very important for journalists to study more living stories, and there are many of them. This is related to show Crimea not only as a territory that Ukraine, that is occupied by the enemy, but the fact is there are people living in Crimea, Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, who are remaining patriots of Ukraine, write more about, tell about Crimean Tatars who were freed from Russian prisons, tell more about stories of people who remained in Crimea after the occupation, fought for Ukraine. And it's very, very difficult. Many Ukrainians now found themselves in the occupied territories of Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and other regions, now understand better, unfortunately, what it means to resist the enemy under occupation. And these stories about very brave people who risk their health, their lives, and they do it. And more needs to be told about them, more needs to be studied about their lives and how they did it.
Thank you. Next question. How do historical relations between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars influence modern joint efforts to build the Ukrainian state after the annexation of Crimea?
Well, if we recall history, it's important to highlight that, unfortunately, for many years, the history of Ukraine was not written in Ukraine, including the history of the relations between Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians.
For
Russian propaganda, it was useful, and they always tried to show a distorted historical narrative between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. And now it's a very important task to show this history as it really was, how this community of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars was formed. This can often be shown through very simple examples, like the Zaporizhian Cossacks. You know, military life required them to have utensils for cooking and eating. Carrying ceramic dishes was difficult. And these dishes were usually made of copper by craftsmen in Crimea. And how did it reach the Zaporizhian Sich? Of course, there was trade between countries, economic relations, certain political various events where one nation supported other nations. And all this must be known. But again, I recall that the story, which is history, and also the future. And it is very important that historians study history, study it objectively, and study it professionally. Citizens of Ukraine, Crimean Tatars Ukrainians, were building the future of Ukraine.
Thank you. I reluctantly agree with you that, unfortunately, we do not learn history well enough. That's why things happen as they do, and no one disputes that. The next question is, what opportunities were there? Challenges arise in the cooperation between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars in the context of decentralization, human rights, and the protection of national minorities in Ukraine.
These are actually three different questions regarding decentralization. Of course, I can talk a lot. For the first time since gaining independence, Ukraine has started a real reform of local self-government. Sometimes it looks like merely an administrative reform. No. It has a very significant philosophical meaning, because Ukraine has always been a country of such communities. It was historical. These communities developed, had certain rights, and had their own economies. This created the strength of Ukraine, its culture and its wealth. Then came the Soviet era, when everything was centralized into a vertical administration. There were no local government rights. It was just an imitation. And when this reform started, it was very interesting. I don't even know how well known this fact is. Now, many experts analyzing Ukraine's resistance in the early days after February 24th say And it is true because I communicate with many community leaders. What is this resistance, thanks to which Ukraine stood firm during the first month of the war and didn't let the enemy capture its territory, at least a large part of it? It was precisely because on the ground there were leaders of democratically elected communities. After this decentralization reform, they organized.
But I am resistant.
They organized territorial defense. They literally created the defense of their communities. And this, there is already a long list of heroic stories when local self-government leaders
Protect
a special Ukraine together with migrants, and all those who study this professionally, who are expert in this field, say that decentralization had such an absolutely unexpected effect on Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Crimea, unfortunately, hasn't seen this decentralization because the decentralization reform began after the year 2014. But now there is a permanent representation of the president in Crimea, and Mejlis leaders are jointly planning how Crimea could look after liberation, what form of local self-government should be there to truly reflect the will and voice of the people who will live there now, to protect the rights of national minorities and indigenous peoples. And then indeed it will be much more difficult in Crimea. There's separatist movements which existed before the war, which almost brought the Russian enemy to Crimea.
Thank you. Next question. How can we personally support the Crimean Tatars in their struggle against the Russian occupation?
I think a really simple way, find someone from young Crimean Tatars friends. I believe you can find many online now. Make friends, ask how they are doing, where they live. If they are in the occupied territories, or if they live in the territory controlled by Ukraine. Maybe organize an event at your university or school related to Crimea. There are many such events now, like Crimean Tatar Flag Day, Indigenous Peoples' Day of Ukraine, and unfortunately, also tragic dates, like May 18th, the day of deportation. Even by talking about such terrible events, like the Holodomor, you can invite or narrate about the famine in Crimea that was 10 years earlier, where the NKVD practiced the mechanism of creating artificial famines. These will be very interesting facts. You could ask someone from the Crimean Tatars to talk about their culture, their dances, music, maybe some other stories. I think there are some really interesting stories. The Crimean Tatars were deported, then lived in deportation conditions for 50 years. And at this time, maybe someone knows or doesn't know, but the culture of the Crimean Tatars, the language of the Crimean Tatars, in general, saying that you are a Crimean Tatar was forbidden. An attempt to return to Crimea ended in arrest. The person was detained, and only after 50 years did the Crimean Tatar return. Started life from scratch. And this is a very interesting story when people massively return 3,500 kilometers. For example, I was born in Uzbekistan. My parents were deported. But they raised us in such a way that
Thank
we
you.
dreamed of Crimea. They said, we might not return to Crimea, but you must return to Crimea. These are very interesting, lively stories. They can be very interesting for Ukrainians too, who have also experienced many years of Russia's colonial policy. This way, Ukrainians will better understand the Crimean Tatars. I can say that today many political leaders in Ukraine, they know, they understand the history of the Crimean Tatars, the situation with the Crimean Tatars, but in Ukrainian society, there is still no clear understanding of who these Crimean Tatars are and why they behave like this. So, when I think of Crimea, as I already said, I first think of the sea because it's a great place to vacation, but it's not about values. And so in this way, it's possible to do.
Thank you. It's interesting. I think very few people know about the Holodomor in Crimea. It's very interesting to look into this situation more, especially since there are people who don't even realize that the Holodomor happened in Ukraine. But now it is much more recognized. Next question, how can we better integrate the Crimean Tatar culture into the overall Ukrainian cultural context?
The first step is to support it so that it does not disappear. If you ask what the Ukrainian government can do, first and foremost, support it so that it does not disappear. Because there are not so many people left, they are not young, who preserved it during and after the deportation. Culture is very, it's fragile. If it's ridiculed, destroyed, forbidden, the population may remain, but it will be marginalized. They won't know their own culture. So firstly, integrate the Crimean culture into the broader Ukrainian cultural heritage. First of all, we need to support its revival and popularization. For example, Crimean Tatar women's dances. Who knows about these dances and how they look? Perhaps you would find it interesting. Or the Crimean Tatar language, which has finally appeared in Google Translate. How does it look? Poems or Crimean Tatar cuisine. Well, maybe more is known about the cuisine and also other cultural elements like patterns. Crimean Tatar ones, they are called ornek. Everyone knows about the patterns of different regions of Ukraine, but few know about Crimean Tatar patterns called ornek, which have such an ancient history. We could mention Crimean Tatar songs. Only when Jamala won at Eurovision, I think most Ukrainians heard for the first time these little fragments of Crimean Tatar songs performed during such a victorious performance at Eurovision. And all of this is very interesting and needs to be involved. And such a Crimean house in Kyiv, an organization that helps to start a life and information about the culture. And such a public organization, Olem, which constantly holds certain events in Kyiv. This slightly, as a Crimean Tatar, as a representative of this worried community, a lot is being done in Kyiv, but Ukraine is not only Kyiv. Few of these events are held in other places. And here is where help can come in. Societies, such leaders of public organizations, journalists, so that all this interesting information about cultural events, about the culture of Crimean Tatars, spreads. Not just in Kiev, but in other cities of Ukraine as well. And this will really provide tangible help. Thanks to this,
Online.
many such cultural interesting events can now be broadcasted.
Thank you. Next question. Does our shared history of the fight for independence help Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars connect and strengthen their interaction and independence? Yes.
Moreover, this struggle began even before Ukraine gained independence. I mentioned in my speech what political leaders of Ukraine, like Vyacheslav Kornovil and Mustafa Dzhemilev, they already, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were already communicating, befriending, and supporting each other. After Ukraine became independent, and to this day, the Crimean Tatars always seek support from Ukrainians. Together with Ukrainians, are planning their future strategy. And for Ukrainians, it is also important, very important, to showcase our own history, partnership, relationship with the Crimean Tatars, because Ukraine is also multinational, and many national communities which are searching for their identity. The leaders of these communities, the representatives of these communities, are also searching for their identity in modern Ukraine and what their places are in this country. And this is exactly an example of cooperation, partnership between Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians to some extent as a response. And this also greatly helps in consolidating and uniting Ukrainian society.
Thank you. Next question. Does the role of journalism in highlighting the problems of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians help the world understand the history of Ukrainians and Tatars?
Of course, it helps, especially unfortunately, after Crimea was occupied, Ukraine and Crimea found themselves at the center of the political journalism trend. And there have been many publications, a lot of news about Crimea, and also about Crimean Tatars. But sometimes it was more, like a political publication. And here one needs to think about what accents to make on this. For example, now in Europe, there are many migration questions. What to do with this migration movement? How to integrate the harmony of migrants from different countries with different cultural and religious views? This example of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians is very interesting because Crimean Tatars are Muslims. And at the same time, they follow the democratic path, the path of dialogue with Ukrainians, self-organization, trying to protect their cultural rights. They do not create, such tension and relations with the state power if the power finds opportunities for dialogue. Of course, it is difficult to directly transfer the experience of Crimean Tatars to other countries.
All right.
In 1998, there is an organization called the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. It's a well-known national foundation that supports projects for strengthening democracy. It held a conference called Living Together. This Living Together conference was held in Sarajevo. It was right after the war. The war had just ended in Bosnia, and there was already peace in Bosnia, but you could still see the consequences of that war. And this Living Together conference invited many representatives from the former USSR, the Caucasus, and the Baltic countries, so everyone could talk about whether it was possible to be living together despite having such conferences. Different ethnic groups live together. Well, and various representatives from these regions spoke, and everyone talked about the war. I remember that someone from the National Endowment for Democracy approached me back then and asked if I could talk about Crimea and Ukraine, because you did not let the war be provoked in Crimea, and at the beginning of the 90s, Crimea was indeed like that. Many such, as they say, conditions began the military conflict in Crimea. Well, the Crimean Tatars returned from Asia, 300,000 locals. The local pro-Russian authorities met them very aggressively. All the Crimean Tatars had their homes that they were forced to leave during the deportation. And the authorities intentionally did not give the Crimean Tatars any opportunities to build new houses, thus provoking them to go to war to free their homes from the people who lived there after the deportation, who had been brought to Crimea after the deportation. The Crimean Tatars did not fall for this provocation. So it was very difficult to build their lives, to build houses, but we kept the peace. And during this time, the Crimean Tatars, the leaders of the Crimean army, the leaders of the Mejlis, had very, very powerful, such a communication and cooperation with Ukrainian Tatar leaders. Firstly, the leaders of the People's Movement of Ukraine and other pro-democratic parties in Ukraine. And then I shared this example at the Living Together conference. Communities, ethnic communities, if they have shared values with this country, they can endure certain, complications in life, certain tests in their lives, to preserve peace in this country. And the Crimean Tatars did it. It was very difficult, but they did it. And it's such a, very important example, because now many countries in Europe, there are no such horrific situations there as in Ukraine after the full-scale invasion. But they also struggle with questions like how to find the basis for integrating migrants in their countries, who sometimes have different cultures, different languages, different religions. And this example, if we talk about it, this is a Ukrainian example, and it is unique in a certain way, which needs to be shared. How is this possible? And this is very important from the point of view, to show Ukraine as a unique country that has its own unique cases, its own unique experience, even now, over the past 30 years. Not only about the war, but also pre-war, so that Ukraine is better known as a country that is seeking its own path, not just a country where there are sometimes corruption scandals or some problems. And in that sense, we need to tell the story of this case of the Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians. It is, in a certain sense, it is unique.
Thank you. And this is the last question. What can the Ukrainian government do to integrate Crimean Tatars into Ukrainian society? And what can society itself do for this?
Well, the Ukrainian government made at least the last important step, which was the approval of the law on indigenous peoples. Thus, the Ukrainian government acknowledges that there are unique, authentic ethnic groups in Ukraine which were formed on this territory that have no other territories outside of Ukraine. And Ukraine, as a democratic country, takes on the responsibility to preserve this culture. Thus, this law is very important. But I think most people here understand that the law is just a framework document. A law is in some way like a slogan. If there is a law but no implementation, no practical realization at the local level, it just remains this framework document. And that is why it is very important for the society to look. Everyone who lives in their towns, in their communities, no matter where they live, in the east or west of Ukraine, in a big city or a small town. What can we do to talk about the Crimean Tatars, about their culture, to talk about what we have in common? How Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians together defend Ukraine. And such interesting stories. I think if you talk with the Crimean Tatars, you will learn, for instance, how the first Ukrainian classes were opened in Crimea. I can recall as a witness that there were none. Crimea was absolutely pro-Russian. At that time, it was impossible to hear Ukrainian language. And the heads of those educational institutions said, no, we will not open Ukrainian classes, teach Ukrainian, because we do not have textbooks. I remember that we then traveled to Lviv. The head of the education department of the Lviv City Council, Pavlo Kobzey, asked him to give some remaining textbooks, brought these textbooks to Crimea, and then these textbooks became the first used for the first classes or lessons for learning the Ukrainian language, primarily in Crimean Tatar schools. And then it just grew more and more. There are some very interesting stories, sometimes funny stories, sometimes such a bit sad. But these are real living stories that need to be known. Well, I think then Ukrainian society will better understand the Crimean Tatars. This will benefit the formation of this cohesive, consolidated community that will be proud of its homeland, Ukraine, and will know how to act. Just to end, I'll say why this is important. Consolidation or unity of Ukrainian society, or forming a political nation. It's not consolidation for the sake of consolidation. Ukraine is on the path to long-term reforms, strategic reforms. It's not a one-year issue. And to implement them, a lot of energy is needed, societal energy. And this energy only exists when society is consolidated and sees its goals for 5, 10, 50 years ahead. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much for the very visual and interesting story and for your presentation. I wish you boundless energy and success in your work. I want to let you know that your presentation will be covered both in Ukrainian and in English, so everyone will be able to read it. Once again, I wish you all the best. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.